Welcome to the Aaron Harber Show. My guest is Leta Hong Fincher, an author of 2 books and also a PhD in sociology. Leta, thanks so much for joining me.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's great having you on the show. Of course, I've read Betraying Big Brother, The Feminist Awakening in China, but you also wrote Leftover Women, The Resurgence of Gender Inequality in China. So I want to talk about that and your historical take on what has happened in China, because of course, years ago, the whole concept was to have equality between men and women, and you saw women in key positions, and it seemed like that society was changing, of course, decades ago. But now you have a different kind of change. So talk a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, it's a very long and complicated history, but I'll try to be brief. Yes, the People's Republic of China was founded on the basis of gender equality. And gender equality was written into the Constitution of the People's Republic. And during the early years of the communist era, particularly in the 50s and 60s, the propaganda strongly promoted images of women as being able to do anything that men could do. One of Mao Zedong's most famous sayings was, "Women hold up half the sky." And the purpose of that propaganda really was to mobilize women to go out en masse and work in factories and work in the fields to contribute to the development of this new communist nation. So that was a really important part of the establishment of the Chinese government and its economy. And so at the end of the 1970s, female labor force participation in China in the cities was around 90%, which must be the highest in the world. It was astronomically high. So of course there was never true gender equality. Behind all the rosy rhetoric, women still were stuck with all the housework. You know, they had to do all the childcare. They were having the babies. They had to take care of the elderly. And then they also had to go out and do work. And there was still sexism. But because everybody was poor, it was communism, you know, there wasn't a huge gender gap in terms of people's wealth. And that all began to change with the onset of market reforms, particularly in the 1990s and into the 2000s with this breakneck economic development in China. And even though the relative poverty of all Chinese people, you know, really was diminished, hundreds of millions of people brought themselves out of poverty because of market reforms. At the same time, that gender gap between, particularly in wealth, the gender wealth gap just increased exponentially.
You also had, of course, tremendous growth in inequality between those who stayed in rural areas and those who are in the cities, and you have that today.
Yes, I mean, inequality across all spectrums, class, you also have inequality, which is related to class based on your location because of this system of household registration in China called the hukou, where basically wherever you were born, if you were born in the countryside, even if you moved to work in the city, you are denied the privileges of urban citizens. So that creates a whole new kind of rigid stratification of society. But I really focus on the gender inequality, which hadn't been paid much attention to, but my first book also focused on this too.
So when you look at the regression of at least the formal government policy, but also what actually happened, I mean, historically, did that surprise you? That doesn't seem to be as common a phenomenon. It seems that when you have that kind of progress, as it were, you usually don't see it slip back, and now you're seeing that.
Well, you know, I actually think that you can't take progress for granted anywhere. And I think you can see globally, just getting aside from the topic of China, you know, so we see the reemergence of strongman authoritarianism around the world. Whereas we had all, so many people were applauding the triumph of democracy in 1989 with the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union and across Eastern Europe. So I don't think you can ever take that kind of progress for granted. And especially in a country like China, where they had a planned economy, they had state-mandated poverty or allocation of benefits like free housing, effectively free housing. And then you have this sudden transition to, a no-holds-barred capitalism in certain parts of China, especially coastal cities. Then I think we've seen around the world as well a huge increase in inequality.
One of the things that has amazed me, I know that if I go back a couple decades, my assumption is, and because of my background in technology, my assumption was with the advancement of technology, Chinese people would become aware of all the opportunities of freedom and everything that was going on in the rest of the world. And so I saw the Chinese people, I saw technology as over time liberating the Chinese people. But the opposite has happened. Give me your take on that and how really incredibly effective the Chinese government has been in terms of surveillance and controlling what people can see, read, hear, view on the internet.
Right. I mean, technology is not necessarily a force for the good. It depends on how you use it. And so in China, for sure, the Chinese government is being incredibly sophisticated at using social media and all kinds of technology, artificial intelligence, facial recognition technology that can detect, your irises. It can have these cameras installed and recognize who's crossing the street and tap into their private records. And so the level of surveillance of the population is truly frightening today. Now that technology is nowhere near as developed as it can be. And so some of the more Orwellian visions or predictions about Chinese technology are a little bit exaggerated at this point because the government is still struggling with some of the technology. But there's no question that they're working really hard on it, and it's becoming increasingly invasive. There's the social credit system that ranks people according to how good a citizen they are. And effectively that means that somebody who is seen as, a troublemaker in some kind is then penalized. Maybe they're not able to buy plane tickets, for example. And so yes, the Chinese government has actually used the internet to monitor the population much more extensively. Most people should be aware of the Great Firewall, the fact that the internet is extremely heavily censored, but it's also used because they monitor people's use of the internet. They can also just snoop into, people's conversations, what they post on social media. That whatever it is that a person posts on social media can be used against them, and they can be arrested and maybe even thrown into jail for what they post on social media.
So when we come back, I want to talk more about the social credit system and also the fact we talk about surveillance. I don't think most Americans, for example, know there are literally millions of cameras now in China monitoring every move people make. And again, I think the assumption in the United States is, well, you can't keep track of almost 1.25 billion people, and the Chinese government is proving that wrong, that actually you can. So we'll take a quick break. We'll be back with Leda in just a moment.
For information on how to help promote civil and mutually respectful discourse and support expansion of the distribution of our programs, please email info@harbertv.com.
Join me and watch the Aaron Harber Show.
Watch the Aaron Harber Show.
Watch the Aaron Harber Show.
Watch the Aaron Harper Show.
Watch the Aaron Harber Show.
I'm Reverend Jesse Jackson. Watch the Aaron Harber Show and Keep Hope Alive.
I'm Aaron Harber, host of The Aaron Harber Show. You can follow the show on Twitter for instant notification of new episodes, live event invitations, outtakes, and behind-the-scene photos. And tweet us your topic and guest suggestions today.
The Aaron Harber Show may be viewed 24/7 at no charge from any location in the world at harbortv.com.
Welcome back. We're with Leta Hong Fincher. So I'd be interested in kind of your just opinion about the fact that a lot of the technology that the Chinese government is using to, in essence, suppress its people, to surveil them, to monitor them, to track them, to penalize them, as it were, and sometimes very severely, is based on U.S. technology that they got from us. Talk a little bit about that, and do we have a moral or ethical obligation to try to address that challenge?
Well, yes, we have a moral obligation to call out the U.S. companies that are enabling this incredible, the world's most authoritarian regime in its building up this unprecedented surveillance state. I'm not the greatest expert on which companies are doing that. I know that Eric Prince's company, for example, has been involved in helping the Chinese government develop its surveillance state and its technology. There are certain companies. I just can't. I'm not.
I think a lot of it, though, isn't necessarily intentional. I think that
Right.
certainly, as you know, if you want to do business in China historically, in the last couple of decades, and you're a high technology company, some of the requirements, if you do business in China, is that you have to do it with a Chinese company, which essentially is the government or controlled by the government. You have to provide your technology as part of any deal you make, so that that company, that Chinese company, and hence the government, has access to that technology. So I would guess in many cases that the Chinese government, through what one would technically say are legal means, though that's another issue, that American companies are allowed to do this in the first place, but through legal means are acquiring U.S. technology. That's also been part of their strategy to advance themselves technologically by not inventing new technology all the time, but by simply acquiring the technology that others have invented. And so I think a lot of that technology is being used for purposes which those companies certainly didn't want or don't want to see it used, but because of the agreements they made and because of their basically priority of making money over worrying about the fate of the Chinese people, the Chinese government has that technology.
Yes, but I might add that it's certainly not all by legal means. I mean, it's quite well documented that Chinese companies steal a lot of technology from American and other European technology companies, and some of these requirements.
And the Chinese government has
Yes.
certainly been accused of doing that quite directly as well.
Yeah, and I mean, one company that is in the news now is Huawei, and the U.S. government is trying to, prevent Huawei from fully developing in the United States, for example, because of some of these suspicions of inappropriate, if not illegal, activity.
Well, and also related to security,
Yes.
that the idea that some of its technology, when deployed, or its products when deployed, create opportunities for spying, for collecting data, and for doing so in what are supposed to be very secure environments.
Right, exactly. So I do think it's incumbent on companies, if we're talking about American companies, to consider their commitment to, democracy itself, to human rights and liberties. And I would point out Facebook as an example of a company that has been really desperately trying to get into the China market, and is bent over backwards to avoid criticizing the Chinese government in any way. There are so many technology companies in America that do that. They really, they're so eager to make money in the China market. And even Google, which, was founded on the principle of supporting, I can't remember their exact slogan, do no harm. But they were considering entering the China market and helping with a search engine there. So this is something that, I hope that more U.S. companies, basically the companies have to be pressured because obviously they want to make money. That's their primary goal. So they need pressure from the rest of, American citizens or whoever it is, or the U.S. government or congressional hearings to make sure that they're not violating human rights. I might point to a historical case. Yahoo, the email provider, actually handed over the personal data of a Chinese citizen using its product because the Chinese government demanded that information, and Yahoo was trying to defend itself and saying, well, we're only following Chinese law, but clearly that was a reprehensible decision, and there were congressional hearings held on that.
Well, I think that the challenge, of course, is that for U.S. companies, China offers for many of them just an extraordinarily large market. And so you have that pressure, that financial pressure to do that. For feminists in China, how do they get around these challenges in terms of being monitored and surveillance and all of that? What are some of the mechanisms used to defeat that?
Right. Well, this is one of the things that I think is truly extraordinary about the feminist movement in China, which I write about a lot in my second book, Betraying Big Brother. One of the successes of the feminist movement is that they're very well organized across boundaries in China. They've been able to mobilize support, particularly in cities among urban educated young women. They're also extremely adept at using social media in China and getting around the intense surveillance of these, government monitors and censors. So they're constantly adapting and changing their strategies in response to the China censors. So just to give one example, with the Me Too movement in China, the Me Too hashtag was really being very, very heavily censored in 2018 when it started to take off in China. And so one young feminist activist came up with the idea of using the emojis. The Chinese words me too sound like me too, but they mean rice and bunny rabbit. So then she had the idea of using the emoji for a rice bowl and a bunny rabbit to substitute for, the Me Too hashtag. And so for a while, those messages about Me Too, stories of sexual harassment or sexual violence, were being circulated with this, that emoji of rice and bunny rabbit. But the censors in China always catch up. And so after a while, that was being censored. But other ways that the feminist activists get around it is to, so they may post something and then it'll be deleted within a few minutes. But then they'll just find another individual social media account and have that person post the same thing. That'll be deleted within a few minutes. And then they're very organized, very creative. They have a large community. And so it continues to inspire me how adaptive they are, how resilient they are, and creative they are. And so as a result of their creativity, the Chinese government crackdown on women's rights activism dates back to 2015. But here we are, more than 4 years later, and there are still all these women's rights issues, Me Too related, related to rape culture. Just within the last month, there was a new viral hashtag, Not Your Perfect Victim, about saying that, rape victims don't have to behave in a certain way in order to prove that they weren't raped. And that went viral as well. And so it's an incredibly resilient movement that keeps springing up just all across China. Ordinary women are feeling more empowered. They see, that there is strength in numbers, and this is one of the things that is very inspiring to me.
All right, when we come back, I want to talk about some of those numbers. We'll take a quick break, and we'll be right back in a moment.
For information on how to help promote civil and mutually respectful discourse and support expansion of the distribution of our programs, please email info@harbertv.com.
I'm Aaron Harber, host of The Aaron Harber Show. Find us on Facebook to get all the latest updates, see behind-the-scene photos, and make comments and ask me questions. You can see episodes before their TV broadcast, so like the show today.
The Aaron Harber Show may be viewed 24/7 at no charge from any location in the world at harbertv.com.
Welcome back to the show. This is our final segment in part one of our special two-part series with Leda Hong Fincher. So I think one of the issues we just touched on and I want to talk more about was the social credit system. I think very few Americans know about this challenge. And I think my concern is people don't realize that once you're categorized, you can be stuck there for a long time and maybe forever. What are the long-term implications of that system, and is there any way to defeat it?
Well, this is a really new system that was implemented, really started to begin to be implemented pretty rigorously, I would say, in 2018. So it's extremely new. It's definitely very insidious because it's yet another way in which you see a huge increase in authoritarian repression in China. This effort on the part of the Chinese Communist Party state to much more closely monitor all of the citizens of China, to prevent them from being tempted to stray and being tempted into social activism, for example. And so this is a way in which there are so many different ways in which it's manifested. It can, sometimes if you cross the street, if you jaywalk, you could lose social credit points, for example. So everybody, it's part of the personal dossier that has long been kept on every Chinese citizen, going back all the way, for decades. So that was something that was not electronic, and now it's become electronic. So it's another way to show to the Chinese government, this person has some kind of history of making trouble in some way. And that person is then going to be penalized by losing out on benefits. Maybe if they're applying for a job, the employer will look at their social credit score and say, oh, your score is so low, we don't want to hire you. Sometimes, they can be prevented from buying plane tickets. So it can hurt them in different ways.
Very, very insidious. Also, and I think your reference, which is really important, is how it can control actions before you take those actions, and how it inhibits a person so severely. Do you know your social credit score?
That's a really good question, and I'm not exactly sure about that. And this is part of the way the Chinese government scares people. I think above all, at this point, it's a method of intimidation, because people are afraid of lowering their social credit score. And so, not everybody, of course, but there are definitely people who think, oh my gosh, I don't want to, get a low credit score.
Sure, it's in the back. It's going
Right.
to be, no matter who you are, it's always going to be in the back of your mind. It's reminiscent of the Stasi in East Germany. I think there are going to be analogies to Nazi Germany over time. And what's really extraordinary, though, is what China has done technologically to control its people. China is also exporting this technology to other countries. I would think that that's something the United States and other countries should unify and fight against. And it doesn't seem that we're doing that, or if you're aware that we are, I'd be interested. I have not heard about that.
Well, there's no question that the Chinese government is exporting that technology or exporting the technology of private companies, but there are really all companies in China that are very successful have close ties to the state. And so...
You're putting it politely, by the way.
Yes.
It's more than close ties.
Yes. These large companies that are listed on the U.S. stock exchange, for example, by and large all have Communist Party cells. And so that's something that maybe a lot of Americans are not so aware of. I think that in general, the threat is greater to countries other than the United States. For example, through the Belt and Road Initiative, which is this initiative by the Chinese government to fund infrastructure in developing countries. And that's where you're really seeing more of a threat from these kinds of very sophisticated surveillance technologies that are being deployed then by other somewhat authoritarian states around the world. They're using state-of-the-art technology from China to then monitor their own population in authoritarian ways. There's no question that the United States is also being affected. I have to say that there is some awareness in the United States. There's this congressional hearings are being held on increased authoritarianism in China. We haven't yet talked about the mass incarceration of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, and that is the part of China where this extremely Orwellian vision of the total surveillance state invading into the private lives of every single person, that is where it is most fully realized, and it's truly terrifying. And so, and there isn't enough press coverage on that in anywhere, including in the United States. And part of the reason why there isn't enough coverage is because journalists in China are so tightly controlled themselves. It's really hard to get access to these camps. And then there are these kind of Potemkin tours for foreign journalists that take you inside a camp, but then they're obviously completely staged. But there's enough reliable evidence coming out that there are massive abuses taking place in these huge detention camps where around 1 million Uyghur Muslims, or if not more, are being held.
Right, and they're re-education camps, according to, of course, the Chinese government.
Well, that's what the government calls them.
Right. So, and you mentioned the number. It's actually, I think the estimates are well over 1 million. I know we have to wrap up, but just one final point. What should the U.S. do in that regard? Because we certainly have surveillance data in terms of the government. The U.S. government knows a lot about what's going on, has not released that information to the public here or globally. Quick thought about what should we really do?
Well, I think that the U.S., certainly with regard to the abuses of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, it could impose the Global Magnitsky Act, for example, to sanction individual Communist Party officials who are overseeing the brutal suppression of the rights of Uyghur Muslims. That's just one method. I mean, there is this trade war with China, which is partly an attempt to address some of the
other issues.
But I personally don't think that that's extremely effective. But I think it is really important for the United States government to stand up for the values that we were built on, to defend democracy and liberty and human rights.
Okay, all right. On that note, this is the end of part 1 with Leda. Make sure you stay tuned for part 2. I'm Aaron Harber. Thanks for watching.
Please contact us. We want to hear from you. And thanks for watching.